I'm not afraid of you anymore. The words tore out of Sofia Morales before she could stop them, her voice barely a whisper but steady as stone in the crushing silence of the warehouse. The slap echoed through the cavernous space like a gunshot, her palm connecting with Nicholas Valenti's face at exactly 11:13 p.m., 30 men in black suits frozen in a perfect circle around them, rain hammering the metal roof so hard it sounded like machine gun fire. The checkered concrete floor beneath her feet gleamed wet from her soaking waitress uniform, black and white fabric clinging to her trembling body. She could smell gun oil and expensive cologne mixing with the metallic scent of her own terror, thick and choking in her throat. The air felt like ice wrapping around her lungs. Valenti's head had turned from the impact, a red handprint blooming on his left cheek like a brand, but he didn't move, didn't speak. His dark eyes found hers and held them, searching for something she didn't have the strength to hide. Rocco's hand was already on his weapon. His jaw clenched tight enough to break teeth. Luca had stepped forward, his face dark as a thundercloud, fists balling at his sides. Every single one of those 30 men waited for the signal that would end her life. The signal that never came. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to a summer thunderstorm and a little girl who wandered too far from home. $78. That was all Sofia Morales had left in the world. $78 folded into the front pocket of her black apron, worn soft from years of shifting and counting and praying it would be enough. It was 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in August, and the kitchen at Harrington's diner smelled like burnt coffee and grease that had congealed into something ancient and permanent on the stovetop. Sofia was 27 years old, but her hands told a different story, calloused from 7 years of scrubbing the marble floors of the Valenti mansion, the dishes at the diner, the floors of her mother's empty house after the foreclosure papers had arrived. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight it stretched the skin at her temples, and there were shadows under her brown eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. The crumpled foreclosure notice sat in her back pocket like a stone. $85,000. In 7 days, the bank would own everything that was left of her family's life. She moved through the diner's kitchen with a kind of invisible efficiency that comes from 8 years of not wanting to be noticed. Flip the eggs. Do not break the yolks. Stack the toast so the butter melts into every corner. Keep your head down. Don't speak unless spoken to. The rules had become so much a part of her that she followed them without thinking, the same way her lungs breathed without asking permission. Margaret Harrington swept into the kitchen at 6:02 a.m., her heels clicking against the tile like a countdown clock. She was 52 years old and wore her money like a weapon, diamond earrings that caught the fluorescent light, a Chanel perfume that cost more than Sofia's monthly rent, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Sofia, the register came up short yesterday." Margaret's voice was honey poured over glass shards. $18. "Mrs. Harrington, I didn't take." "I know you did." Margaret pulled a cigarette from her purse, even though smoking in the kitchen was illegal. She lit it anyway. "I have been generous to you. I gave you work when no one else would." It was a lie. Sofia had earned every penny of her wages through 60-hour weeks, through nights when her feet bled into her shoes, through mornings when she'd eaten stale bread from the garbage rather than spend money meant for the house payment. Margaret stepped closer, and Sofia could smell the alcohol underneath the perfume. Tequila. Before 7 a.m. "I'm taking it from your check," Margaret said. "From your tips, actually. The tips you claim to earn but somehow never show me. The ones that keep disappearing." Sofia's fingers trembled as she cracked another egg. The yolk broke. It spilled across the white like blood in milk. "And while we're discussing your dishonesty," Margaret continued, tapping ash into the sink without looking, "your mother called the house yesterday. Crying about the foreclosure. It's pathetic, really. Couldn't even keep a roof over her head. No wonder you're struggling. It's in your blood." The egg spatula felt heavy in Sofia's hand. For just a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to turn around and swing. She didn't. She never did. Instead, she scraped the broken yolk off the griddle and started over. Yes, Mrs. Harrington, Sofia said quietly. By 2:33 p.m., she had worked 14 hours. Her tips had been exactly $5.87. A quarter from an old man who remembered her from last month. $1 and change from a construction worker. Loose pocket change from a woman who had smiled at her for the first time. Sofia counted it 3 times on the back steps of the diner, making sure she wasn't hallucinating. $5.87. Margaret's $18 accusation meant she was now short $12.13 from what she needed just to eat for the next week. She walked home through the August heat, the sun beating down like a hammer. The neighborhood where she lived wasn't a place on any map that mattered. It was the gap between the rich areas and the poor ones, the place where the foreclosure notices outnumbered people who could read them. Her mother's house, the one her grandmother had owned, the one that was supposed to be theirs forever, was a small ranch with peeling yellow paint and a mailbox stuffed with final notices. Inside, the air was thick and still. The utilities were off again. The power company had sent another letter. Her mother, Lucia, sat in the kitchen in a chair that had belonged to Sofia's grandmother. She was 51 years old and looked like a woman in her 70s. Her hands shook as she held a cup of water. "Your boss called," Lucia said. Her voice was like paper. "She wanted to tell me that you were stealing from her. She said shameful things about our family." Sofia felt something inside her crack like ice under weight. The rage was so sudden and so complete that it turned her breathless. "I didn't steal anything," Sofia said. "She's lying." "I know that." Lucia reached for her daughter's hand, but Sofia was already moving toward the refrigerator. Inside was a single bottle of milk and 3 eggs. She had hidden them in the back, counting on Margaret not searching. "We have 7 days," Lucia whispered. "Maybe we could talk to the bank. Maybe if we explained." "No." Sofia closed her eyes. "They won't listen." The rain started at 4:22 p.m. Not a warning rain, but a sudden violent downpour, the kind that came out of nowhere in the middle of summer and turned the streets into rivers within minutes. Sofia was still wearing her diner uniform. The black and white fabric clung to her skin. She had a second job at the Valenti mansion, a position that had been arranged through a cleaning service and paid in cash under the table. $50 a week to sweep marble halls and dust surfaces she was never supposed to look at directly. 7 years of being a ghost in a house where ghosts were expected. She caught the bus with 3 minutes to spare. The driver barely glanced at her as she climbed aboard, soaking wet and shivering. No one ever looked at Sofia Morales directly. She had become the kind of person who had learned to occupy space without taking up room. The mansion sat on a hill that overlooked half of Boston. Even in the rain, it was beautiful. Ice-white columns. Black shutters. Gardens that had been designed by someone famous whose name Sofia would never know. The gates opened with a code that had never been changed in 7 years. 8-2-4-7. She let herself into the side entrance, the one for staff, and began her work. The floors were like mirrors. She could see her own reflection bent and distorted in their surface as she moved, a ghost looking back at herself. It was during the 3rd hour, when the rain had turned biblical and the power had flickered twice, that Sofia heard a sound that didn't belong. A child's cry, high and panicked, cutting through the storm like a blade. She dropped her mop. Every instinct told her to run. Don't get involved. Don't be seen. Don't matter. But the crying didn't stop. Sofia climbed the marble staircase without permission, which was a violation of every rule she had internalized. The 2nd floor was dark. The crying came from the east wing, near a set of French doors that opened onto a terrace. The child was standing in the rain, soaked through, shivering violently. A girl, no more than 5 years old, with dark hair plastered to her head and eyes wide with terror. She was wearing a pink pajama set with a bunny on the front. "Daddy," the child was crying. "Daddy, where are you? I'm scared. I'm so scared. I want my daddy." Sofia moved forward without thinking. Every survival instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, but something older and deeper took over. Something that had been drowned in bleach and poverty and fear for so long that she had almost forgotten it existed. She lifted the child into her arms, wrapped her in her own soaking uniform, and stepped back inside. The girl weighed almost nothing, like she was made of glass and bird bones. "It's okay," Sofia whispered. "You're safe now. You're safe." The child's arms wound around her neck, and she cried into Sofia's shoulder with the kind of abandon that only children can achieve. Sofia stood there in the darkness of the mansion, holding someone else's daughter, and let her cry until there was nothing left. It was 7:23 p.m. when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the halls. The child, Emma, was asleep against Sofia's shoulder, her breathing soft and even. Sofia didn't move. She stood perfectly still, waiting for the disaster she had just created. The lights came on all at once. He stood in the doorway like something drawn from shadow, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Sofia's annual salary. His dark hair was slightly wet from the rain outside. His eyes were the color of a storm, and they fixed on Sofia with the intensity of a predator who had just caught the scent of something it had been hunting. This was Nicholas Valenti. Sofia had never met him in 7 years of cleaning his house. She knew his name. She knew he was dangerous. She knew the news stories about him, the whispered conversations between other staff members, the way people's voices changed when they spoke his name. But nothing had prepared her for the actual presence of him, the way the air itself seemed to compress in the same space as his body. "My daughter," he said, and his voice was deep and solid like an oath carved into stone. She went outside. Sofia's voice had become a whisper. Into the rain. She was frightened. "I brought her back." For a long moment, he didn't move. He just looked at them, at his daughter asleep in the arms of a woman he had never met, someone invisible to his world, someone who should have known better than to touch anything that belonged to him. Then his expression changed. Something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest, but not directed at Sofia. He reached out and gently took Emma from her arms, holding the child with a tenderness that transformed his face into something almost human. "What is your name?" he asked, still looking at his sleeping daughter. "Sofia," she whispered. "Sofia Morales." He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition. Not of her, he could never have recognized someone invisible, but of something she carried, something in her that understood fear and survival and the particular loneliness of holding on to things that slip away. "Thank you," Nicholas Valenti said. And in that moment, without knowing it, Sofia Morales had just opened a door that would change everything. 7 years. That was how long Sofia Morales had been invisible in the Valenti mansion. The black and white checkered floor stretched out under her hands, cold marble that had been scrubbed 1,000 times before and would be scrubbed 1,000 times again. 5:30 in the morning. The house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the wet sound of her brush moving across the stone in the basement service corridor. She had changed into her uniform in the staff room downstairs, 3 other housekeeping maids in that cramped space with its single flickering light and a mirror so old it reflected her face back in fragments, like she was already breaking apart before the day even began. 16 bathrooms before the family woke. That was her quota. Rocco and Luca, the 2 men who stood by the kitchen entrance most mornings, their suits already pressed and perfect at 5:45, never once looked at her as she passed with her bucket and bleach. She was part of the infrastructure. Invisible as the pipes running through the walls. Her hands were red. Raw from the chemicals, from the constant scrubbing, from 7 years of being a ghost in a place where money moved like an ocean and she was drowning in it without anyone noticing. The bleach smell had become part of her skin. She showered and it was still there. She slept and it was still there. It had become her perfume, her signature, the thing that announced her arrival before anyone even saw her face. Sofia was 28 years old and looked 40. The mirror didn't lie about that. She earned $847 every 2 weeks. Rent took $530. The utilities, electricity, water, the phone line she needed in case the care facility called, took another $110. She sent her mother $300 every month, though it broke her to do it, though there was never enough. The medications came first. Then the facility fees. Then the small dignity of a private room so her mother wouldn't have to see the other patients. That left her with $78. In her pocket, pressed against her chest like a wound that wouldn't heal, she carried a crumpled white envelope. The foreclosure notice had arrived on Thursday. $85,000 due within 7 days or the house would be seized. The house where her mother had raised her. The house where they had been safe once, before Douglas, before everything broke. The letter had been opened by the caseworker at the facility, read aloud to her mother with the same casual tone you might use to discuss the weather. Sofia had been called to come get it. Her mother had cried. Sofia had not cried. Her tears had dried up somewhere on a Greyhound bus 15 years ago, the same bus that had carried her away from Douglas Hale's fists. She finished the 16th bathroom at 7:15. The family never saw her leave. By 8 o'clock she was on the Red Line, standing in a car with businessmen who smelled like expensive cologne and futures that extended beyond the next week. She got off at Downtown Crossing and walked through the summer heat to Margaret's Diner on Hanover Street. The diner was the same every day. Chrome and red vinyl booths that had been cleaned so many times the fabric was shining through. Fluorescent lights that hummed like sick insects. The smell of coffee that had been burning since before dawn and deep fryer oil that had been changed sometime during the Obama administration. Sofia changed into her waitressing uniform in the bathroom, white blouse, black skirt, a name tag that said Sofia in letters so faded they were barely readable anymore. 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. 8 hours on her feet. 8 hours serving people who did not see her. 8 hours watching tips appear on tables, tips that meant milk for her mother's morning oatmeal, tips that meant her phone wouldn't get disconnected, tips that meant she was not yet completely erased. Tuesday night came in slow. A handful of regulars at the counter. 3 couples in the booths. A man who ordered coffee and stared out the window for 3 hours without drinking it. By 11 the dinner crowd had thinned. By 1 a.m. it was just insomnia and exhaustion and the sound of the grill in the back where Tommy, the cook, was smoking a cigarette he was not allowed to smoke. Margaret Harrington emerged from the office at 1:55. She was 53 years old and looked 32 because of what her surgeon could do and what her husband's money could buy. Her hair was highlighted the color of expensive champagne. Her nails were manicured. She wore a Rolex that cost more than everything Sofia owned, including her mother's ring that she kept on a chain under her uniform. Table 7 and 9, Margaret said, walking past Sofia without looking at her. You miscounted the tips again. Sofia was pulling her apron off. She had not miscounted anything. She kept a mental ledger in her head, a running total that she recalculated every hour. It was the only way to survive. I counted them 3 times, Sofia said quietly. Margaret turned. Her smile was the smile of someone who had learned that cruelty was just another language, and she was fluent. Don't make me report you for theft, Sofia. The tips are rung in as the restaurant's portion. If money goes missing, that comes out of your salary. Unless you want me to call the police and tell them you've been skimming. Sofia watched Margaret's hand slide into her designer purse. 320s disappeared into the silk lining. $60. That was 3 days of food. That was the difference between her mother having her arthritis medication delivered or calling the facility to say she couldn't afford it this month. I'm sorry, Sofia whispered. She had learned to apologize for things that were not her fault. 8 years of Douglas had taught her that. 7 years of invisibility had reinforced it. Margaret walked back to the office without responding. Sofia finished her shift at 2 a.m. The diner's exterior lights blinked off as she walked out into the back bay summer, and the heat hit her like a living thing. 92 degrees at 2 in the morning. The air so thick and humid you could feel yourself drowning in it. The streets were empty except for a few cars moving like sharks through still water and a homeless man sleeping under the awning of a closed bank. She walked home through the quiet streets, her bag slung over her shoulder, the foreclosure notice still in her pocket like a death sentence folded into an envelope. $78 left. $85,000 owed. 7 days remaining. The mathematics of despair. She did not know that in exactly 14 hours, her mother would call the facility screaming because the pain in her legs had become unbearable, and the facility would call her and tell her that without a new medication, $300 a month, starting immediately, her mother would spend the rest of her life sedated, essentially gone. She did not know that at 6:30 a.m., her landlord would serve her a notice of eviction for non-payment of rent she had paid on time every single month, a notice that would be made in error but would take months to resolve. She did not know that in the rain-soaked playground of the estate she would clean in exactly 13 hours and 40 minutes, a small girl with dark curls and her father's grey eyes would wander away from her nanny, and Sofia would find her crying under the swing set, and in the act of carrying her back through the summer downpour, she would unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would either save her or destroy her completely. She did not know that the man whose mansion she had been scrubbing for 7 years, the man whose face she had glimpsed only once, the man whose name made other people's voices change, would wake that next morning with a daughter who had nearly been lost and a woman he had never met to thank. She did not know any of this. Sofia walked through the empty Boston streets at 2:30 a.m., and she carried her $78 and her foreclosure notice and her 7-year-old invisibility like a burden that was about to become unbearable. The heat pressed down. Her phone buzzed once, a text from the facility. She did not read it yet. She was saving the moment when she could absorb whatever bad news it contained. 3 more blocks to her apartment. 3 more blocks of sidewalk that no one had swept clean. 3 more blocks before she could sit in her kitchen and count the pennies in the jar on the counter and try to decide which of her mother's medications was most essential, which could be delayed, which would need to be sacrificed. She did not yet know that everything was about to change. The kitchen lights hummed with a white fluorescence that made everything look sickly, sterile. Sofia's hands moved across the cutting board with mechanical precision, carrots into thin coins, celery into perfect half-moons, onions layered and ready for the sauté pan. The rhythm was muscle memory, the kind of work her body could do while her mind fractured into 1,000 terrified pieces. Because what she didn't understand yet was that saying yes to Nicholas Valenti's offer had just shifted something fundamental in how the city saw her. She was no longer invisible. And that visibility carried a weight she couldn't yet measure. Emma's voice still echoed in the kitchen air. "Are you staying? Please stay." Sofia had meant to say something reassuring. Instead she'd said nothing at all, just knelt there with her hands shaking slightly, looking into a child's face and seeing her own childhood reflected back, that same hunger for someone to stay, someone to choose her, someone to not leave. The knife came down harder than intended. The sound cut through the quiet like a gunshot in silence. "You're distracted," Valenti said from behind her. She flinched, nearly dropping the knife. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his shirt sleeves now, the formal jacket abandoned, and there was something almost domesticated about the image, except his presence made the entire room feel smaller, like the walls had inched closer just from him breathing the same air. "I'm fine," Sofia said, turning back to the board. "Liar." He moved into the kitchen with that controlled walk, each step deliberate, the way a predator approaches something wounded. "Your knife work is perfect. Your breathing is shallow. Your shoulders are at your ears. You are not fine." Sofia set the knife down carefully. This was the first time Valenti had come into the kitchen while she worked, the first time he'd spoken to her as anything other than an employer giving directions. It felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'm thinking about Margaret," she said quietly. "About how long she's been stealing. About all the women she's hurt. And I'm thinking about Douglas." The name hung in the air between them like a blade. Valenti pulled out a bar stool and sat at the counter, an almost absurd gesture, this man who commanded entire criminal networks sitting 3 feet away like they were having coffee between shifts. "Tell me about him." "You already know about him." "I know the facts. I want to hear the truth." Sofia wiped her hands on her apron, though they were already dry. Her fingers found the small scar on her left wrist almost automatically, the one she'd gotten when she'd tried to leave 3 years ago and he'd put her hand through a glass picture frame. We met at a club in Southie. He was beautiful then, you know? I was 22 and working 3 jobs and living in a studio with 4 other girls, and he seemed like salvation. The memory tasted like copper and regret. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward. He said it was because he loved me so much that the thought of me ever leaving him made him crazy. He said he couldn't help it, that I made him do it by talking to other men, by wearing dresses that were too short, by existing in ways that threatened him. Sofia's voice had become monotone, the kind of flat effect that comes from repeating a story too many times. And I believed him. For 8 years, I believed that if I just was smaller, quieter, more careful, it would stop. But it didn't stop. It got worse. She looked up at him finally. The last time, he broke 3 ribs and my left arm in 2 places. He told me if I ever left him again, he'd find my mother and make sure she never worked another day in her life. He'd destroy her the way he was destroying me. So I stayed for another month, and then one morning I just left. I called my sister's ex-boyfriend who had connections to the Irish cruise, and I asked if I could disappear. He got me a new identity for work, a fake social security number, and a job at the diner. Valenti's expression hadn't changed, but his hands had clenched into fists on the counter. The gold Cartier watch he wore caught the kitchen light. That was 3 months ago, Sofia continued. I thought he couldn't find me. But Margaret knew Douglas in high school. She's known where I was working this entire time. And instead of telling me, she told him. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had weight. Outside, Boston's evening traffic hummed at a distance, car horns, the muffled roar of engines, life continuing indifferent to the rupture happening in this kitchen. Douglas doesn't have access to your mother anymore, Valenti said finally. 3 hours ago, my people brought her to a safe house in New Hampshire. Your sister is there too. They're protected now. No one touches them without my permission. Sofia felt something inside her break open. Her mother. He'd protected her mother without asking permission, without negotiating, without expecting anything in return. For 3 months she'd been carrying the weight of her mother's safety alone, rationing medications, skipping meals, working double shifts to accumulate money for impossible legal fees. You can't move people like that, she whispered. I can do whatever I want. That's the advantage of building a criminal organization. The disadvantage is that everyone you've ever met expects you to use it for your own purposes. He leaned forward slightly. I'm using it for yours now. Why? Because Emma asked you to stay. Because you carried her through a thunderstorm without knowing who her father was. Because Margaret has stolen from at least 47 women that I can document, and the thought of her continuing to walk around Boston unpunished is actually offensive to me in a way I didn't know I could feel anymore. He stood up from the bar stool and moved toward the stove, where a pot of water was just beginning to simmer. The gesture was so ordinary, so domestic, that it seemed impossible, a man like Nicholas Valenti checking the temperature of water like a person who knew how to cook, who had stood in kitchens and made meals for people he loved. What are you doing? Sofia asked. I don't know how to cook, he said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice. I wanted to stand here and do something productive while we talked about the fact that the man who hurt you for 8 years just made a very serious mistake. What mistake? He sent a message 40 minutes ago to a number he thought was still yours. He said he knew where you were and that you had until tomorrow night to meet him at the Riverside Diner, or he was going to come find you himself. Sofia's knees went weak. She grabbed the counter to steady herself. His outside, Valenti continued, his voice dropping into something colder now, something that sounded like thunder wrapped in velvet. 3 blocks away. Sitting in a black sedan. He's been watching the service gate for the past 2 hours. The water came to a rolling boil. Valenti turned off the heat. So we have a choice, he said, looking directly at her. We go to him, or we let him come to us. Either way, Douglas Hale's life as he understands it is over in the next 72 hours. The only question is whether you want to watch. Sofia's hand found the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket, that crumpled piece of paper she'd been carrying like a curse. Except it wasn't a curse anymore, was it? It was just evidence of a lie. Just a fabrication by a man who loved her so much he needed to destroy her first. "I want to watch," she said quietly. Outside, the night had settled over Boston like ink. And somewhere in that darkness, Douglas Hale was about to discover that the invisible woman he'd hunted for 3 months had just become impossible to touch. The slap echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot in the silence. 30 men froze. Rocco's hand went to his jacket. Luca stepped forward, then stopped, waiting for the signal that would end her life. The sound hung in the air between them, not the crack of skin on skin, but something deeper, something that shattered the unspoken hierarchy of every room Nicholas Valenti had ever occupied. Sofia's hand was still raised. Her arm trembled. Blood rushed to her face, not from shame but from 8 years of terror finally combusting into action. She had just struck the most dangerous man in Boston. She had just committed suicide in front of 30 witnesses. But Nicholas Valenti did not move. He stood there, completely still, his jaw tight where her palm had connected. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He touched it with one finger, examined the blood, and something shifted in his expression, not anger, but something closer to recognition. "Leave us," he said quietly. "So?" Rocco's voice was uncertain, dangerous. "I said leave us." 30 men in black suits filed out of the kitchen in complete silence. The sound of their footsteps retreated down the hallway, deliberate, controlled, confused. Marco was the last to go. He paused at the doorway and looked back at Valenti with an expression somewhere between concern and awe. In 23 years of service, he had never seen anything like this. When they were alone, Valenti turned to face her fully. His grey eyes were glacial, unreadable. "You think you can hurt me?" "I think I can stand up to you," Sofia said, her voice barely steady. "I think I spent 8 years learning to be small, and I'm done being small." "You want to know what changed?" "It wasn't Douglas. It was watching you read bedtime stories to Emma. It was watching you tuck her hair behind her ear and tell her that monsters aren't real, that she's safe. And I realized you believed it. You actually believe you can be something other than what you are." "Sofia, I'm not finished. You pulled me into your world because you saw me as broken, as something you could fix. But I don't want to be fixed by a man who solves problems by destroying them. I don't want Emma to grow up thinking that violence is love. I don't want," her voice cracked. She grabbed the counter to steady herself. "I don't want to become invisible again, just in a different way. Just invisible in your shadow instead of invisible in Margaret's diner." Valenti was quiet for a long moment. Rain continued falling outside the kitchen windows, softer now, almost gentle. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not harder, but somehow more vulnerable, stripped of the armor that had protected him for decades. "When my brother sold our family to the Costillanos, I was 19 years old," he said. "My father was still alive. Strong. Powerful. They came to his office and they took everything, his business, his reputation, his will to fight. He died 3 months later. A heart attack at 61. And I swore that I would never let anyone take anything from me again. That I would build something so strong, so untouchable, that nobody could touch it. Touch me." He moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the rainy Boston night. The scar on his face caught the light, that thin line running from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night he'd killed 3 men to reclaim his father's honor. "Emma's mother died when she was 6 months old," he continued. "Cancer. The kind that money couldn't cure, that power couldn't stop. And I learned that my empire means nothing if I can't protect the people I love from suffering. So I built walls instead. I told myself that kindness was weakness, that gentleness was just another word for vulnerability. And then you came to my house and you cleaned my floors and you were so broken, Sofia, so completely shattered that I couldn't fix you with money or power or protection. The only thing that worked was sitting next to you. Just being there. Not fixing. Just witnessing. Sofia was crying now, tears streaming down her face, soaking into Emma's stuffed rabbit that she still held against her chest. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "If I stay, if I let myself love you, I'm afraid I'll become dependent again. I'm afraid I'll lose myself the way I lost myself with Douglas." "You hit me," Valenti said, turning to face her. "That's not dependency. That's courage." He walked toward her slowly, deliberately. His hands were open, unthreatening. He was 6'1", 215 pounds of muscle and scar tissue and raw power, and he moved like a man approaching something sacred and fragile. "I don't need you to be broken," he said. "I don't need you to be grateful or small or invisible. I need you exactly as you are right now. Angry. Terrified. Standing up to me. That's the woman I'm asking you to stay for. Not the victim. Not the maid. You." Sofia wanted to argue. Wanted to maintain the wall she'd spent 8 years building. But Emma's rabbit felt warm in her hands, and the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket no longer burned like a curse. Margaret Harrington was being booked into federal prison as they spoke. Douglas Hale was disappearing into the Castellano family's private entertainment, screaming apologies that nobody would ever hear again. She was safe. For the first time in 8 years, she was actually, genuinely safe. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide," Valenti said. "You can leave. I'll give you $200,000 in cash, a lawyer, a safe place anywhere in America. You'll never see me or Emma again. Or you can stay. Not as an employee. Not as someone I'm rescuing. But as someone I'm choosing. Every single day." He reached out and gently took the stuffed rabbit from her hands. His fingers brushed hers and the touch was electric, terrifying, alive. "Emma drew you pictures," he said. "She asked me where you went. She cried for 3 hours because she thought you were gone. She asked me if you didn't love her anymore." Sofia's knees buckled. She grabbed his shoulders to steady herself, and suddenly she was crying so hard she couldn't breathe, couldn't stand, couldn't do anything but collapse against him while he held her in the middle of his perfect kitchen at 3:20 in the morning, rain falling outside, the whole world sleeping and knowing nothing of this moment. "I love her," Sofia gasped. "I love her so much it terrifies me. And me." His voice was soft against her hair. Sofia pulled back and looked at him directly. His face was wet with rain that had somehow gotten inside. His scar was still visible, still a reminder of violence and pain and everything he'd survived. But his eyes were different now. Open. Genuine. Human. "I'm still angry at you," she said. "I know. And I'm still terrified. I know that too. But yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'm staying." 3 minutes later, Rocco appeared in the doorway carrying fresh coffee. He took in the scene, Sofia in Valenti's arms, her face streaked with tears, his hand gentle on the small of her back, and he withdrew silently, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, he texted Marco with 3 words, "Everything just changed." Outside, the rain began to ease. By dawn, Boston would wake to clear skies and the kind of silence that only comes after storms. But inside the mansion, in that kitchen that smelled of lemon polish and coffee and hope, Sofia held the stuffed rabbit and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the invisible woman had finally been seen. Word count, 1,347. 6 months later, Sofia Morales stood in the kitchen of the Valenti mansion wearing a blue dress instead of the black and white uniform that had defined her for 7 years. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the gold band on her left ring finger, a band that hadn't been there yesterday. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was Emma's nanny, Nicholas Valenti's trusted advisor, and the only person in Boston who could tell him he was being an idiot without ending up in a shallow grave. The foreclosure notice that had once burned like coal in her pocket now sat framed on Valenti's desk, a reminder of who she'd been and proof of who she'd chosen to become. The kitchen smelled like lemon polish and fresh coffee and something else entirely, hope, perhaps. Real, tangible hope instead of the desperate kind that evaporates the moment the sun rises. "You're smiling," Emma said, padding into the kitchen in her dinosaur pajamas, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd carried through the storm that night. The child was 5 years old now, thriving, secure, loved in ways she'd never known were possible. "Are you thinking about the wedding?" "I am," Sofia said, lifting the girl onto her hip. Emma's weight felt like everything. Like home. Like proof that broken things could be held and healed and made whole. "Are you excited about your princess dress at the ceremony?" "Only if you promise that Papa won't cry when he sees you in your wedding dress," Emma said with the absolute seriousness of a kindergartner delivering a major life decision. "He cried when you agreed to stay, and Marco said crying is not good for a boss." Sofia laughed, pressing her forehead against Emma's. "I promise your Papa will be strong and brave." What she didn't tell the child was that she'd already seen Nicholas Valenti cry. She'd seen him collapse under the weight of finally becoming human again. She'd watched his shoulders shake as he read the letter she'd written, the one he'd asked her to finish, the one that ended with "I love you, and I'm not running anymore, and maybe monsters can choose to be human if someone believes they're worth saving." The sound of black SUVs echoing up the driveway pulled Sofia from her thoughts. 3 vehicles, arriving in precise formation, stopping at the mansion's entrance. The leather creaked as 4 men in tailored suits emerged, their movements coordinated like a choreographed routine. This was Valenti's world, men arriving at dawn with news that would reshape the day. Sofia had learned to recognize the difference between routine security briefings and something worse. The way Rocco held his jaw suggested this was something worse. She set Emma down and moved toward the kitchen window, watching as Rocco approached the lead SUV and exchanged words with Marco, who'd been Valenti's lieutenant for 18 years. Marco's face was stone. Whatever he was hearing made even the granite figures surrounding him look uncertain. "Go find your father," Sofia told Emma quietly. "Tell him Rocco needs him." Emma nodded and scampered away, the rabbit bouncing against her hip. Sofia stood at the window, watching the men in the driveway, feeling the familiar tightness creep back into her chest. This was the part she still struggled with, the way the criminal underworld could intrude on ordinary mornings, how violence and power moved through this house like weather systems no one could fully predict or control. 3 minutes later, Valenti appeared on the mansion's front steps. 6'2", shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of an entire empire, dark eyes sharp as a blade. He moved with the particular grace of men who'd learned that economy of motion kept you alive. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his cashmere coat draped over one shoulder. He'd been in his office, probably reviewing the legitimate businesses that now comprised 70% of his wealth. The empire was changing. Real estate development, construction contracts, a shipping company that actually shipped legal goods. The men still wore suits and carried weapons, but increasingly, they carried contracts and architectural plans. Valenti had told Sofia once that every villain eventually realizes that survival requires redemption, or at least the appearance of it. But with Sofia, she suspected the redemption was real. Emma had taught him things that money and power never could. Sofia watched as Rocco spoke, his voice too low to hear through the window but his body language screaming urgency. Valenti's expression shifted, the dangerous calm descended like a curtain closing. He nodded once, twice, said something to Marco that made even the oldest lieutenant flinch. Then he looked up at the mansion window where Sofia stood. Their eyes met. Even from this distance, even with the glass between them, she could read the message in his gaze. Something was wrong. Something required her presence. She left Emma in the care of Lucia, the nanny she'd hired to handle daytime responsibilities, and made her way downstairs. The marble entry hall was cool beneath her feet, the sound of her steps echoing off walls that had witnessed decades of criminal transactions. She'd learned to walk through this space like she belonged there, no longer shuffling, no longer invisible. The staff learned to step aside for her now. Not out of fear. Out of recognition that she held something none of them did, the boss's trust. Valenti was in his office when she arrived, the room all dark wood and leather, walls lined with books he'd learned to read for pleasure after Sofia started leaving novels on his desk. The foreclosure notice hung in a shadow box on his wall, her 5-year-old ghost and her 23-year-old present preserved together. "What happened?" Sofia asked, closing the door behind her. "Margaret Harrington is dead," Valenti said simply. Sofia's breath caught. Margaret Harrington, the restaurant owner's wife who'd stolen Sofia's last tip money, the wealthy woman who'd tormented her for a decade, the architect of her financial destruction. Margaret, who should be serving 40 years in federal prison. Margaret, who Sofia had thought she'd be processing her anger toward for the rest of her life. "How?" Sofia's voice came out steady, which surprised her. She'd imagined this news would shatter something in her, but instead she felt oddly calm. Detached. As if she were observing her own reaction from some distance. "Suicide," Rocco said from the doorway. 3 days ago, in her cell. Hanged herself with torn bed linens. They're saying the other inmates made her life hell. She couldn't handle being seen. Couldn't handle being nobody after spending her whole life making sure everyone knew her name. The irony wasn't subtle. Sofia felt it land like a knife. Margaret Harrington, who'd wielded her wealth and social connections like weapons, had ultimately learned the lesson Sofia already knew, that power was illusion, and eventually, everyone is reduced to their own bare humanity. "There's more," Valenti said quietly. He pulled a letter from his desk drawer, aged paper, handwriting shaking and frantic. "She wrote this before she died. It arrived this morning." The letter was addressed to Sofia Morales. Sofia took the paper with trembling fingers and read, "I am sorry. I stole from you when you had nothing because I needed to feel powerful over something, someone, anyone. I destroyed you to make myself feel less destroyed. But destroying you didn't heal me. It just made me more hollow. I hope Nicholas Valenti killed me in the way that matters, by proving that mercy is stronger than cruelty, that you were worth saving, that I was always nothing despite my money. I hope you become everything I never let myself be." Sofia read the words 3 times. Then she set the letter on Valenti's desk and sat down in a leather chair across from him, the same chair where 6 months ago she'd confessed her fears, her past, her love. "She took her own life," Sofia said. "Not a question. A recognition. Yes. Because she realized that wealth and cruelty and power, none of it was enough to make her matter. Yes." Sofia thought about Margaret Harrington in a federal prison cell, wearing the same uniform as everyone else, stripped of the trappings that had defined her existence. She thought about the other inmates, the women who'd suffered Margaret's theft and exploitation, finally having their own form of power in those confined spaces. She thought about Margaret, utterly alone, absolutely powerless, finally seeing herself clearly. And she felt something unexpected, not satisfaction, but sorrow. Sorrow that Margaret hadn't learned sooner. Sorrow that it took total destruction to teach her what Sofia had discovered through her own survival, that your worth isn't measured in dollars or status or social position. It's measured in the capacity to love, to protect, to choose gentleness. Douglas Hale. Sofia asked, though she knew the answer. She'd received confirmation 6 months ago. Valenti's men had found him in a warehouse in New Jersey, alone and paranoid, living off cash and fear. She'd never asked what happened next. Didn't need to. "Federal prison," Rocco said. 5 concurrent sentences. He'll die in a cell. His parole hearing won't come for another 15 years, and even then, they'll reject him. The statements from the other victims were, Rocco paused, searching for the appropriate word. Thorough. The men she'd been afraid of, the men who'd left marks on her body like receipts for violence, they were gone. One dead by her own hand, one imprisoned with decades stretching ahead like a life sentence. Justice didn't look the way she'd imagined it would. It wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was simply the natural consequence of actions meeting their inevitable end. "You're thinking something," Valenti said. Sofia looked at this man, the criminal who'd become her protector, the violent man who'd learned to be gentle, the broken person who'd recognized her brokenness and refused to exploit it. She thought about how 6 months ago she'd stood in this same office wearing a maid's uniform, holding a crumpled foreclosure notice, believing herself to be nobody. She thought about the moment she'd slapped him in front of 30 men, thought she was about to die, and instead found herself chosen. Rescued. Loved. "I'm thinking that I survived," Sofia said quietly. "I survived Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington and poverty and fear, and now they're destroyed and I'm still here. Still standing. Still whole." "You are," Valenti said. He moved from behind his desk, knelt in front of her chair, a gesture that made Rocco actually step backward and close the office door. Nicholas Valenti, the man whose reputation had been built on violence and vengeance, was on his knees in front of a woman he'd once considered his employee. "I was going to wait until the wedding tomorrow, but—" He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Inside, not an engagement ring, but a key. A house key, old and silver, attached to a charm shaped like a heart. "My mother's house," he said. "In the suburbs. Emma's always asking if we can have a normal place. Somewhere without guards and memories. I thought, if you wanted, we could make it ours. All three of us. No underworld. Just a family." Sofia felt the tears come then, hot and real and earned through years of surviving things that should have broken her. She pulled Valenti upright and held him close, breathing in the scent of his cologne and expensive fabric, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to everything. Yes to normal. Yes to family. Yes to all of it." Outside, the Boston morning continued. Cars moved through the streets below. Ordinary people went about their ordinary days, never knowing that inside the mansion on Beacon Hill, a woman who'd once had $78 to her name and a lifetime of scars had just chosen forever. Never knowing that the darkness she'd survived had not swallowed her. Never knowing that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to disappear, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one brave enough to kneel. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. And Sofia Morales, who'd once been nobody, was finally seen. Word count, 1,847. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with the people you love. Every comment you leave is a precious source of motivation. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace.